Good to go.
Okay. Dear friends, welcome to this wonderful evening for the release and discussion of one of our most important publications of the 2024-25 cycle, Clio Revisits Callio. It has been quite a journey for me as an editor and publisher to see how an experienced and renowned scholar like Professor Kesavan Veluthat fashions a work as lucid and as important from his ongoing research. Exactly 1 year from when we discussed his current writings, which were at the intersection of history, literature, and the evolution of language in changing socio-political contexts, he handed over a complete manuscript to my delight. So finally, when this book is being released, representing our director, Mr. Shugat Jain, our founder, Mr. B.N. Verma, and the entire Primus team, I feel privileged to welcome you on to an occasion where the significant scholars of the field have gathered here today to share their observations on the book. Before I introduce you to our panelists, please allow me to say a few words about the author. Professor Kesavan Veluthat has taught history in the universities of Calicut, Mangalore, and Delhi. He has been visiting professor in many universities in India and abroad. An author of several research papers and half a dozen books in English, including The Political Structure of Early Medieval South India, The Early Medieval in South India, and The Notes of Dissent. He also writes frequently in Malayalam and is involved in the translation of Malayalam and Sanskrit texts. Now, please allow me to introduce you to the scholars who are on the panel for this discussion today. Professor David Shulman is Professor Emeritus of South Asian Studies at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. He is the author of many significant works, including The Right on Kutiyattam, uh, Tamil, a biography, and More Than Real, a history of the imagination in South India. Then we have Professor Whitney Cox, who teaches at the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations, University of Chicago, and focuses his research on literary and intellectual history of southern India in the early second millennium CE. His important works include Modes of Philology in Medieval South India and Politics, Kingship, and Poetry in Medieval South India. We have with us Professor Yigal Bronner, who chairs the Department of Asian Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He teaches and writes about Sanskrit poetry and poetic theory and South Asian intellectual history. He is the author, co-author, and editor of several books, including Extreme Poetry, uh, the South Asian Movement of Simultaneous Narration, and First Words, Last Words, New Theories for Reading Old Texts in 16th Century India. Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, who is with us, is Executive Director of the International Research Division, India International Center, Delhi. She was Founder Director, National Mission for Manuscripts, Executive Director of Sahapedia. Her books and essays include critical studies on literature and the arts and translations from Malayalam and Sanskrit. Her latest book is Kathakali, Traditions, Innovations, and Transitions in the Dance Drama of Kerala. We have with us Professor Manu V. Devadevan, who teaches history at IIT Mandi. He is the author of significant works such as the early medieval origins of India and a prehistory of Hinduism, and he has edited important volumes like Clio and Her Descendants. Apart from his works in English, he writes frequently in Kannada and Malayalam. So before I request all our panelists to release the book and begin the discussion. Please allow me to introduce the book itself in a few words. In 2019, Professor Manu Devadevan edited the volume Clio and Her Descendants in honor of Professor Kesavan Veluthat with Primus Books as the publisher of the volume. It is my conjecture that Professor Veluthat has given us the return gift of exploring poetry in Sanskrit, Malayalam, and Manipravalam, the amalgamation of these languages and their literary forms as a historian for the earlier work of Clio's descendants. Uh, uh, Now, studying Sanskrit Kāvya of Kalidas, Bharavi, and Magha alongside the extremely innovative effect of the Manipravalam poets with equal panache. Professor Veluthat tells us that even when the theme taken up by two texts are the same, each has a different flavor and character, and that it is the social formation which produced a literary piece that determines them. In Clio Revisits Calliope, he shows us that the two muses, one emblematic of history and the other of poetry, are intertwined in our meaning making of the past. A sense of history is essential in appreciating poetry. So, also, a literary sensibility is a desideratum in understanding the past. I would now request all our eminent panelists to hold up the book in their hands and release it. Thank you, professors, for releasing the book formally. It is such a happy occasion for us. And now, because Professor Whitney Cox has to might have to leave us for his class and teaching in 45 minutes. So I would like to invite him to talk about and share with us his observations about the book first.
Thank you very much, Prasunji. And yeah, and I actually think
Uh,
that as often I got my timing wrong
we
with going
can't
from India
hear
and
you,
time.
Professor Cox.
You can't hear me? I'm not muted.
Hmm. I hear you clearly.
Okay,
Nothing.
okay.
You can hear me okay, David?
Yeah.
I can hear you. I can hear
Okay,
you.
thumbs up. Okay. So anyway, I'm delighted to have a chance to say some words about Keshavan, to whose work as a historian I'm very lastingly indebted. As a young research student, I can say nothing else than that I had my mind blown by the political structure of early medieval South India, and would go on to draw heavily upon it in my own work in my history of Kulothonga Chora. So I'm very happy to have the chance to publicly declare that Keshavan's historical scholarship, if I may be indulged to self-quote from a note in my book, combines empirical exhaustiveness and conceptual vigor to produce the most satisfying political anatomy of medieval South India. It was an even greater joy then to learn some years after encountering him as a historian, to learn how much of a Sahrdaya Keshavan is as well, a lover of literature. I hope you'll allow me one more quick anecdote. I am, as Prasunji just said, teaching an undergraduate course on the Mahabharata in translation right now, and I might have to leave to get to my class, but I think it'll work out. As I was preparing my lecture a few weeks ago on the Sabhaparva, in the second book of the great epic, I heard a knock at my door telling me about the arrival of my postman. I stepped outside and found the envelope containing my copy of Clio Revisits Calliope, which I immediately tore open, sat myself down at my desk, and read in rapid succession the volume's appendix, the Mahabharata, an epic of epochal transition, as well as its fourth chapter on Magha's Shishupala Vadha, excuse me. And voila, the rest of my lecture for the next day wrote itself.
Mhm.
Um, This was for me a pure example of anabravrishti, the welcome rain from a cloudless sky. Um, so I'm already indebted to the author, to the book, as I am to Prasunji and the team at Primus for expediting things so well. So to first of all, to turn to the book itself, there is, above all else, I think, the pleasure that comes from reading Keshavan's translations, especially his translations of the all-time classic works of Kalidasa, Bharavi, and Magha. All of these are a model of elegance, of a remarkably sensitive command over English, we might call Keshavan's own Padalalityam, and above all, the lifelong thoughtful acquaintance he's had with these masterworks. It's fair to say, and I hope he won't mind me saying, that he is a sort of classicist in his interests, invested in these immortal masterpieces as a reader of Sanskrit poetry. For all that he's willing to level real criticism of these poets and their works, he sees them, as the tradition always has, as the pinnacle of the great Kāvya tradition. And this brings us to, I think, the fascinating dilemma at the heart of the book, what I'll call Keshavan's twin pairs of spectacles. His discipline as a historian demands of him that he asks tough questions of these works and the societies in which they emerged and where they were first consumed, while his instincts as a Sahridaya pulls him lovingly back towards the poet's words and their worlds. Nevertheless, making these two sets of spectacles align can be quite difficult. It reminds me of something, one of the many memorable quotations attributed to A.K. Ramanujan about translation, that the only thing that's difficult about it is its impossibility. As Keshavan is a translator into English and Malayalam both, it would be especially valuable to have his thoughts on this. But I can think of no better instance of these challenges and how he faces them than his early essay on the image of the urban in Kalidasa. The cities of early historic North India, from the period of the second urbanization around the lifetime of the Buddha to their demographic decline in the early centuries of the Common Era, has long been a feature of the work of Indian historians, especially those writing in the tradition, as Keshavan self-consciously does, of the great D.D. Kosambi and R.S. Sharma. The thesis of urban decline is a major building block in their vision of Indian feudalism, and Keshavan very effectively brings this vision into conversation with three Kalidasan passages. The Meghadutas twin images of Ujjain, dominated by the Mahakala temple, and its picture of the fantastic wonderland of Kubera's Alaka in the end of the poem, up high in the Himalayas. And then third, to most great extent, the baleful portrait of the abandoned Ayodhya, told to Rama's son and successor Kusha by the city's Adhidevata herself in Raghuvamsha 16. The way that Keshavan reads these passages draws attention to three crucial points: the burgeoning dominance of the temple as the central institution of urban life, to the seeming expense of the city as a commercial hub, the temple being a site of consumption rather than production or circulation, the irreality and fixity of even Kalidasa's prodigious imagination when it comes to turning to portraits of urban life, especially in his kind of begemmed Disneyland of Alaka. And finally, and most suggestively, the forlorn goddess of Ayodhya describing the city's decline and her appeal to Kusha to return the Suryavamshi kings to their erstwhile capital. This last passage, which he renders absolutely beautifully, he sees as, and I quote, realistic with no recourse to stock phrases and formulaic expressions, unquote, which indeed it is. As often with Kalidasa, the powerful emotions never slides over into bathos. For me, as a reader, somewhat fitfully a reader of Tamil as well, this reminds me of another forlorn city goddess, the spirit of Madurai's abandonment of the city at the climactic moment in the Silabadigaram, just before Kanaki destroys it in the purgative fire of her Karpu. But here we're kind of at the nub of the dilemma of the Sahridaya historian. To conclude, as Keshavan does, that this serves as a kind of collateral evidence for the urban decay in the age of the Guptas is, I think, convincing and almost surely correct. But it seems to me to kind of push us up to an evidentiary limit. The Sahridaya can delight in the fantastic description or droop at Ayodhya's pathetic state, excuse me. But we remain on two tracks, kind of trying to focus our two sets of spectacles. For reasons of time, I'm just going to finish now. I don't have much to say. There's so much more about the further riches of the book. I hope, for instance, we get a chance to talk about Ghiyasuddin, or perhaps better, Uddhara Thakura's Haryana Prashasti, one of my favorite chapters in the book. But I'll save my final words of praise for Keshavan for what I find to be his wonderful account of early Manipurvalam in Kerala. Here, I was delighted and really kind of awed by, I think, the way he brings the two sets of spectacles into perfect alignment, arguing against the inherited consensus that this literature was the product of the season when Nambudris went into heat. That's his own translation of Alam Kolam's Nambudri Marude Polapukalam. Kesavan provides his readers with a brilliant materialist sketch of Kerala's medieval agrarian order and gestures towards his own revisionist argument about the caste order of medieval Kerala in his own short but powerful paper, The Congealing of Castes in Medieval Kerala from Notes of Dissent, an argument that went on to in turn influence Manu's very important essay, Caste, Gender, and the Landed Patriarchy, and which has, since I read both of these pieces a few years ago, colored nearly everything I've written or thought about medieval the societies of medieval South India. In seeing the birth of Manipurvalam in the nexus of the performance cultures of the Ambalavasi communities, especially the Chakyars, and looking out onto both the Brahmanical Manams and the flourishing entrepot port societies of the coast, Kesavan gives us both innovative social history and a new way to read these poems, not just as louche displays of late medieval Kāvya luxuriance, but as a view of the world at one remove, as it were, a perspective enjoyed by the poem's courtesan heroines, perhaps, as it is by their own Ambalavasi authors, caught betwixt and between the world of their Nayar and Nambudri patrons and the new commercial societies of the coasts. As both a contribution to our knowledge and as a model for how to read as a student of history and a lover of poetry, I am deeply indebted to him for this, as I am for many, many other things in this wonderful book. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kesavan, and thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Whitney Cox, for such a wonderful amalgamation of both the intricacies of translation and, on the other hand, the imagination of the context, bringing that to us in such a short time. Thank you. Now we move on to Professor David Shulman. I would request him to say a few words and share his thoughts in the book.
Thank you. Namaskaram. Kesavan sir and friends. It's not every day that we get a great historian who also enters the domain of Kāvya and has a lot to say about it. I think that Kesavan is the finest historian we have today of medieval pre-modern South India. But as Whitney has just said, he also is clearly a very good reader of Kāvya. And even more important, he actually loves reading Kāvya. One who knows Kesavan knows that. And he can quote, you can quote verses for many hours. I think he even loves reading Magha, even though he has a slightly hesitant remark about Magha as the beginning of a kind of state of decline in the Kāvya project. But I don't think he could possibly have translated the Shishupala Vadhat into Malayalam, which is in itself a mind-boggling feat. I don't think he could have done it if he didn't actually love the book. And I know from long experience that it's a delight to read a Sanskrit verse with Kesavan, and also fascinating to see his vision of where the poetry is situated on the historical continuum. I do have to say that that initial chapter about the rise and fall of the Kāvya project leaves me with a kind of hesitation, because although I believe very much in the rise of the Kāvya project, I don't actually believe in the fall of it. I think that the Kāvya production in all parts of India over the last 1,000 years or so is, for the most part, magnificent. And I don't think it's really a very good idea to think that there was a decline. There's a kind of narrative of decline, but I would hesitate to go with that. I was thinking that perhaps it would be right to say about Kesavan and Magha and the Shishupala that he's a bit like the author of the Natankusha, which is the book that we have, actually really the only true evidence that we have from the maybe 15th or 16th century about the way Kuriyatam was performed. But it's a critical book, ostensibly hostile book, attacking the Kuriyatam tradition. But actually, anybody who reads the Natankusha knows that the Natankusha author apparently was actually a very devoted aficionado of Kuriatam. So I think maybe that might apply to Keshavan vis-a-vis Maga. And I would just like to say it'd be wonderful to read the Naishadiyya with you. I wish you had been with us in our seminar on the Naishadiyya in Jerusalem some years ago. But I also want to address the chapter on the new sensibility, which Whitney has already mentioned, because here I have something to say. It's also close to my own interests. So I think that the attempt to define the sensibility of the Manipravalam materials in Kerala, that's a very worthy enterprise, because I believe that sensibility, perhaps more than any other indicator, tells us something about cultural or civilizational change. Sensibility is a kind of intangible notion. It's not like doing economic history or agrarian history. But it is possible, I think, sometimes to actually define in specific ways what it means to see a new or to read a new sensibility. There's the Russian poet Mandelstam who said that it is not faith, but taste that moves mountains. And I think that that's true. And taste is what sensibility is all about. And we can see over the long periods of time, we can easily see shifts in taste. And that includes this Manipravalam moment. So let me just mention, I think I'll mention 3 or 3.5 of the indicators that Kesavan has given us in this chapter. It's a very rich and stimulating chapter. But I think it would be possible for us to give a longer list of the components and elements and analytical parts of the emergent sensibility of Manipravalam poetry. So let me begin by saying something about the language. So obviously Manipravalam, we know it's a kind of strange amalgamation of Sanskrit and Malayalam. We also know that Malayalam, like all other Indian languages, is diglossic. That is to say, there's always a fairly large gap between the colloquial spoken language and the, I don't know, platform or written language, or the standard language, if there is such a thing. I don't really think there is such a thing for any of the languages. So there's a diglossia in Malayalam, but actually we would be better off, I think, to speak about a quadriglossia, because in Kerala we have this unusual situation. I think it's perhaps unique in India, of the diglossic starting point. Malayalam is written and Malayalam is spoken. But then we also have Sanskrit, which actually functions almost as a kind of additional register, expressive register for poets writing in Manipravalam. And Sanskrit's a language. It's also this available library. In fact, if we talked about 4 languages, the 4th being Tamil, which has a history in Kerala, a long history, then we can see that we have 4 corpora, or 4 libraries, vast libraries in every case, that enrich the expressive potential of the emergent sensibility. So that's one thing. Also, you'll notice that it's an inclusive quadriglossia. Sanskrit, it's easy to think of Sanskrit as having a kind of exclusivity about it, but actually, no, it's very inclusive. And in Manipravalam, we see it, in fact, in Malayalam in general, we see it in every sentence. So that's one thing. We might want to talk about the nature of the audience, the new audience, which is consuming and producing these words. So now we know something about it. Kesavan has mentioned the urban or proto-urban elements. I think we would have to say about this audience that is reading the Manipravalam text that it is both an erudite audience, learned in Malayalam, of course, but also in Sanskrit and possibly also in Tamil. And it's also a moneyed audience, as we know from Abhilash Malayal's work now. And that creates a particular kind of expressive domain, specific perhaps to Manipravalam. I don't want to say more about this. We would really need Abhilash to be here to say anything of real value, but let me just say we have the linguistic component, which Keshavan writes about. We have the new audience, and then there's an element of the regional identity or the what I would like to call the specificity or the boundedness of Kerala. Kerala is a very unusual case. In general, let's call them political and social boundaries in India are extremely fluid. But in Kerala, they're actually geographical boundaries, and it has created a kind of arena in which the particular regional identity of Kerala comes to expression. And it comes to expression first in the Mani Pravala materials. We also see it in Sanskrit and in Tamil, but I think the fact that we have awareness, a specific awareness and consciousness of Kerala and what it means to be in Kerala and what the available resources are, that is something which I think is very much a part of this new sensibility. I'll just mention one last thing. We could mention others, but one of the elements, I think, in the sensibility that we were talking about, something that Keshava mentions, and that has to do with this range of satirical, ironic, parodic, comic modes, which we see in all kinds of genres in Kerala. It's there in Kudiyattam performance, we know. The Vidushaka likes to quote a Sanskrit shloka, and then he gives a Prati shloka, which is a parody of the original one. And much of that particular sensibility, that comic, reflexive, satirical, maybe parodic, much of that is, I think, a defining characteristic of this literature. It's not only in Kerala and in Malayalam, of course. Kesavan himself has written about the Mahisha Shatakam, which belongs to the Tamil country. It's a parodic text, but it's very prominent in Malayalam. People might say that this is a kind of Nambudiri sensibility, but I think it goes well beyond that. And I would want to list that along with things like the technique of quotation that we see in Poonam, like the realistic strand, and like the existence of writing, and so on. So I'm going to stop at that. Let me just thank Keshavan for this brilliant essay, which I think is a foundational essay when we come to Mani Pravalam. And let me thank you for being my friend and our friend.
Thank you, Professor Shulman, for painting such a wide canvas and pointing towards the broader implications of this work in poetry, in language, and so many other aspects along the lines of the context that these are set in. So now we move on, and I'll request Professor Yigal Bronner to share his observations about the book.
Thank you, Prasunji, and thank you, Kesavan, and everyone who is here. We're discussing a very unusual, a very special book. So while reading it, I resorted to an unusual technique, and I decided to pretend while reading it not to know who the author is and make some hopefully intelligent guesses about his or her identity based on just the book itself. And here are some of the conclusions I arrived at in this practice of reading. And I must say that the author has something of a split personality. At time he, I assume it's a he, identifies or even embodies the ideal of the Nagarika or Sahridaya, a Kāvya lover who is the intended audience of many of the works that are discussed in this book and described in the introduction, for example, as, and I quote, cultivated gentleman, well-versed in many arts and crafts, eminently suited to the urban milieu and the royal court. His interest was the enjoyment of the flavor of the elixir of Kāvyas, Kāvya Amrita Rasa Aswad, end of quote. And indeed, like this uh, Nagarika, who is also the author of the Bhana in chapter 8, the author of our book moves around the fairgrounds of Kāvya literature and depicts with a sympathetic eye and amazement what each counter has to offer. And this author is really open to all of the stalls on this market or fairgrounds and their varied goods. And I note the range of this volume because it's really hard to find a book on Kāvya written with such a range, banas to more established plays, epic and canonical Mahakavyas, prashastis and satires, Sanskrit and Manipravalam and Malayalam. And some of the best moments in the book is when the author simply allows himself to enjoy the richness of this market without passing any judgment. And the enjoyment he feels, I felt anyhow, is precisely because he embodies this ideal of someone who is delighted by the words dancing, to quote from page 93. This sense of harsha. Harsham na kasya kurushe yuvaraja esha is from chapter 8 again. That harsha is felt by this author throughout the volume. But our author has a co-author, and this author, seemingly a historian, is way less prone to enjoyment, and in fact sometimes seems almost ashamed by the pleasures of his collaborator. And he often throws in a note of dissenting judgment about the qualities of Kāvya or the moral problems of the text. Sometimes I felt like I was reading the Vishwa Gunadarsha Champu with these two Gandharvas flying in the sky above the world of Kāvya, and one of the authors loves it and the other passes negative, less positive judgment. Even in the titles of some of the chapters, we have decay and fall, as David is already talking about this. Now, this historian author is well aware of the historical context from which he's speaking, and he says that, for example, in page 146, that the depiction of courtesans in the works discussed and as marking, quote, moral degradation and cultural decadence is passing judgments employing standards of one period and looking at other periods. So our historian is aware of this, but despite the statement betraying his historical sensitivity, he sometimes forgets himself, I think, especially when it comes to some of the most cherished works of the Sanskrit canon. And according to this judgment, the project of Kāvya, I quote, achieved its full course by the time of the early medieval. And another quote, what followed were repetitions and imitations, starting from perhaps the Shishupalavada of Magha, certainly from the Naishadhya Charita of Sri Harsha, to the point of nausea, end of quote. So, but what happens miraculously in this book is that these two authors, the historian and the Kāvya lover, fuse their muses, Clio and Calliope, and they leave their differences behind, and they collaborate in a very beautiful, productive way. And this happens when the literary sensibilities of author one are powerfully harnessed to a close and non-trivial historical reading of author two. And because of the limitations of time, I'll give examples just from the last chapter. That is not really technically a chapter, but the appendix on the Mahabharata that Whitney has already mentioned. And the main argument of this chapter is a beautiful, very powerful argument, is that the Mahabharata is a text of transition on many levels. But what I want to point out is how this argument is is made possible by the kind of literary sensitivity of author one. Uh, um, so, for example, the argument about the change from oral culture to written culture as encoded in the text, our authors are not, our two authors here are not the first to argue this, but they anchor their historical reading uh, by this kind of uh, by this kind of literary ear. So, for example, what allows these historical claims is a close reading of the portrayal of bards and the ambivalence towards the figure of the Sutta when contrasting, for example, the depictions of Ugrashravas and Karna, or even the kind of ambivalent depiction of Karna himself. Then there is this argument about the change in social organization and economy that the Mahabharata betokens. And again, this is not the first time that we find this argument, but our authors anchor it by listening to silences in the text. For example, the absence of land as property and land grants in the gambling scene where Yudhishthira loses everything. You need to listen very closely to the text to note what Yudhishthira is not gambling and not losing, because it seems like he's gambling and losing everything. Or the irrelevance of money and trade and the buying of services, etc., in what Kesavan calls the main narrative layer of the text. And similar points are made in the highly original analysis of inheritance in the epic, where of the Mahabharata repeatedly justifies the disruption of the primogeniture rights of the characters, or in forms of marriage, including that of cross cousins in the case of Arjuna and Subhadra. As the book notes perceptively, the didactic section of the Mahabharata, I quote, disapprove. The didactic sections of the Mahabharata disapprove of cross-cousin marriages strongly. But it is interesting that the lineage survives through Abhimanyu, the child born of this marriage. So again, this is a kind of a very close reading of the text that I think is very, very powerful. And I love this appendix, by the way. And so I think this is one example of several in the book where there is a very fruitful collaborations between these two anonymous co-authors of the book. And I want to end with an anecdote that Kesavan has told me once. And he told me that he was, I think, standing one day in a bus stand about to go and register to be a student of literature at the university at I think the MA level. And by chance, somebody passed there and asked him what he was doing. And Kesavan said, Kesavan, you will please correct whatever details I embellished or invented or misremembered in the story. And Kesavan told that person, this kind of mentor figure, that he was on his way to register as a literature student. And that person said, oh no, that would be a terrible idea. That's the best way to hate literature, is to be a student of literature. And that's how Kesavan ended up a student of history and the eminent historian, the most eminent historian of South Indian history today. But he managed to keep his love of literature and in this last book to harness it, I think, to some very perceptive historical conclusions. So on that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yigal Bronner, for taking us deep into the rasa of poetry and also pointing out the techniques of history writing that have been used along with appreciating poetry in a close manner. We now move on to Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan. Sudhaji, I will request you to talk about the book and share with us the observations that you have. You have to unmute yourself, Sudhaji. There will be a mute button on the. No, you have to deselect it. On the mic button, if you tap once.
I think I have
Yeah,
unmuted.
yes,
Yes, some icon was
yes,
coming in between. So
yeah, we can
yeah.
hear you now.
Thank you, Prasoon, and namaskaram to everybody. And I'm so happy to share my own thoughts to this wonderful book on Keshavans. Because I also feel that this is partly my own book also, because we had started, as Keshavan has said, we had started reading this together as a kind of a vinoda, so to say. All the kavyas that were mentioned here, the Shishupalavatham, Kiratarjuniyam, Raghuvamsham, and also the Maniprabhalam poetry. We enjoyed them so much. And at that time, like Yigal said, that there are two people who are in this book, but I didn't see the historian at all. It was the real Jessica whom I saw, and we paused at it at many, many points. We thoroughly enjoyed when we would go up to about 1.5 hours every day on an everyday basis, and we would go more than 10, 15 poems, verses a day, but then sometimes slow also, because some would be so fascinating that you would stop and enjoy it, and it went on like that. But at that time, I was not aware of his Kāvya project, in which he did a translation, a very thorough translation of verse by verse, word by word, to of these all the of the two kavyas that he has done. I think he's going to be doing the next, I think, I'm sure. So this also was very an interesting project, which finally, I think, then when I stopped and went about my business, he also analyzed them historically. Then the historian came in, and it was a wonderful, and we have this book as a result, is this book that has come about. So I think the main thing is that the mutuality that we see between history and literature, the historian and literature, that's what we see throughout this book, is what I feel. It is not just a new information to combine history and literature, but he has given it in a consistently throughout the book, like in a science lab, looked at each and every one of these uh, poems, and then subjected to them a very thorough investigation. Perhaps he may have had an earlier model in Romila Thapar's book on Shakuntalam. She has written a book, Shakuntalam, the study of Shakuntalam in text, readings, and histories. He may have been, he may have read the book, and perhaps that must have been one of the inspirations that this impelled him to write this kind of an extensive, exhaustive analysis of each of these poems one by one. It is also clear that he loves his Mahakavyas. There's no doubt about that. And as also Manipravalam, in fact, I have more to say about this chapter that David was talking about, the new sensibility, a little later. But like I think Yigal said, that I don't know why Mahabharata is given as an appendix, because I believe that all his points about history, about the different aspects of history, the transitions from the tribal to the agrarian to the state formation, all these aspects, and also other themes like the pastoral and the kinship and inheritance, like it was said here, pre-literate and literate, the transition from pre-literate to literate societies. Maybe what you mean is oral to the written, perhaps. I mean, that's one aspect. And also about kinship and inheritance, trade, urbanization, and all these things, all these themes come into his own analysis, which perhaps is not how a literary critic or somebody who, I mean, so there is that kind of double advantage that he has brought into this. Coming to this, the new sensibilities, the book, his analysis of Manipravalam, I have some differences from his. Of course, it's a Kāvya project. It does have Sanskrit is a main, as it happens in Leela Tilakam, is written in Sanskrit. But I always want to say that Manipravalam is not just a statement on that Sanskrit, that is a Sanskrit Kāvya. I believe that I feel that he has taken some pains to make it closer, at least till the first part of the Manipravalam, up to the Charitams and the Charitams and the Sandesha Kavyas. But what about the great overflow of Kavyas that happened later? And for example, what is stated as the purpose of Sanskrit Kavyam is to be regarded as the same for Manipravalam, according to what Leela Tilakam says. Yet Samskrita Kavyasya Prayojanam Kathyate Nimittam Cha Asyabi Manipravala Kavyasya Mantavyam. Agreeing to that, I think after Leela Tilakam, it takes Manipravalam to a much more greater extent. You have, for example, in this book, divided this into the corpus, for example, you have fixed it in a way into three champus, two sandeshas. For example, Unniyachi, Unniyati, Unnicharidavi as the three champus, the two sandeshas, and two kavyas. But what about the tremendous output that happened, like that flowed out of and formed what we call Malayalam today? I think it was at a point at that time that Malayalam was wanting to break out of that shell of Sanskrit, or even whatever they used to be called as Tamil, and then forming its own language, its own idiom, its own expressive power. So while we were talking about the new sensibility, perhaps, for example, when we read that poetry in the Indian National Center, we did not restrict it to that part of Manipravalam only, but we dealt with the whole range of it, not just the erotics of it, but also the other aspect of it. So I wonder if that were to be also have been included. But having said that, I think that's not, I mean, what you have treated is a very, very extensive field, as also like David was talking about the satire and the two kinds of comic that you have treated. One you say as as the carnivalesque aspect in Rasasadanabhanam, and the deeply satiric, ironic satiric in Mahisha Shatakam. So all these, I mean, it's a very, very extensive treatment of Kavya in its diversity, in its in exuberance. And thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhaji, for telling us about the translation and poetry and the way this book would have perhaps come together. Now, as we are going towards the end of the observations, and before I invite Professor Manu Devadevan to share his thoughts, I would like to request those in the audience, if they have any questions, they can put their queries in the chat box, and we will take them up after Professor Devadevan has spoken and before we go on to hear from the author, Professor Veluthat himself, as to how the book came about towards the end. So we will be looking out for your queries, and please put them in the chat box. Now I would like to invite Professor Devadevan to take us through his impression about the book, and we look forward to hearing from him. Professor Devadevan.
Thank you very much, Prasoon. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay.
We can hear.
I've had the privilege of being Kesavan's student, and I've also had the privilege of reading the essays in this book at different times in the years since I've known Kesavan in person. I've known him since July 2007. That's 18 years now. And the essays here were written over a period of some 25 years or so. and mostly delivered as lectures at various events. So if I recall correctly, the oldest of them was the first draft of the Mahisha Shatakam paper, which Kesavan presented in the University of Pennsylvania. So I didn't get to read this paper. I didn't know him at the time. So I got to read a revised version of the paper a few years later. It evolved eventually into the introduction that he wrote for the Mahisha Shatakam. The next in chronology was the piece on Manipravalam poetry, which he delivered as the Foundation Day lecture of the ICHR in New Delhi. Those were actually interesting times for research on the Manipravalam literature in Kerala, when an attempt was being made to move away from Ilangulam Kunyampillai's theory of Manipravalam as an erotic pastime of the what shall I call the affluent and the leisure-loving Nambudiri Brahmanas. Chatana Tachutanuni, for instance, and M.R. Raghav Warrior produced a few interesting editions of the Manipravalam texts, and they argued that these were actually inventories of trade networks and not what Kunyampillai had posited. And I wrote a rather disappointing doctoral dissertation in which I had this to say on the Manipravalam, that all the early Manipravalam texts, except the Unnichiridevi Charitam, were set in political centers, and all of them, including the Unnichiridevi, had to do with women who provided hospitality to the rulers, and more importantly to the itinerant population in the town. In fact, I had gone to the extent of identifying somewhat naively 6 specific services which the women provided: food, tambulam, lodging, gambling, dance and music, and sexual services. After all, those were times when hundreds of people traveled widely, and the travelers could only check into one of these places of hospitality, or maybe check into a monastery. There was no Marriott, no Radisson, no hotel, no Shangri-La. And then Kesavan wrote this paper in which he pointed to the similarities in urban sensibility that Manipravalam shared with the earlier Sanskrit poetry, the Sanskrit poetry of earlier times. And he also argued that Manipravalam was actually Sanskrit poetry written in Malayalam. Now, when I read these papers, what I felt, and I still believe this to be true, what I felt was that his thinking was profoundly influenced by the empirical rigor in examining sources such as inscriptions, which he learned from the works of Nilakanta Shastri and M.G.S. Narayanan. We all know this. And influenced by Marxism, which as far as his historiography was concerned, came from D.D. Kosambi and Ramcharan Sharma. Whitney just mentioned that. We all know this as well. But at the same time, he was influenced rather profoundly by the strong sense of anthropology that one notices in Romila Thapar's works. And Romila was one of his teachers in JNU. And I'm glad Sudha Chechi pointed to Romila's influence on Kesavan, although in a very different sense. And that is why I believe questions concerning kinship, lineage and descent are important for Kesavan. Questions concerning pre-state and state-centered forms of political organizations are important for him. Questions about urbanization and decay of urban centers, and questions concerning orality and literacy are important for him. These are questions that bother him even when he is reading Kalidasa, even when he is reading Magha, even when he is reading Bharavi. And so, when he's reading Bharavi's Kiratarjuniya, he is unable to read it as a text in itself. Although when we speak to him, we realize, as Sudha Chechi just mentioned, we realize how profoundly he is enchanted by the aesthetics of the text. In fact, when he was on the mountains in Manali in 2017 to enjoy the snow, he kept telling, or rather more appropriately, he kept chanting like a mantra, Eko hi dosho gunasannipate. And then for all his dislike of Jayadeva's Gita Govinda, I've often heard him recite lines from it, such as Padmavati Charana Charana Chakravarti and Madhura Komala Kanta Padavali. All that is true. But when he is reading the Shakuntalam, he is doing it in relation to the Shakuntalopakhyan of the Mahabharata and vice versa. So this this intertextuality pervades his reading of literature. So when he's reading the Shishupalavada or when he's reading the Kiratarjuniya, he is not only trying to understand how things such as the city or the state or kinship ties and successions are configured in the text, but also how they differ from the episodes in the Mahabharata from which these texts borrow their themes. Now, some of the essays often caution us against the conditioned modes of our thinking. So, we all have our own ideological preferences, our own ideological prejudices. The ideological weight that we inherit from earlier generations of scholarship about Oriental despotism, about private property, aesthetics, the functions of poetry, these often have the power to remove from our gaze what is otherwise visible as daylight. The Mahisha Shatakam paper is actually a wonderful instance of this kind of an intervention. So it says that the text is a great example for the use of literature for purposes of political dissent. And when we read the text, when we read the Mahisha Shatakam, the first and foremost thing that one notices in the text is that it is a piece of sharp political criticism. Now, one would obviously want a commentator on the text to say something more, a little more, something beyond what is so obvious. And yet, one cannot but help wonder why generations of scholarship have failed to acknowledge the most glaring aspect of the text. Now, what is disappointing though is Kesavan's reluctance to bring the rich ideas about the text that he has. The rich ideas that he has about the text is often not seen in his writings. And one only has to speak to him to learn how rich these ideas are. And what is even more disappointing is his reluctance to go beyond the theory of legitimation. He's certainly aware of the limits of the theory. He is aware of the critique of the theory. In fact, when I wrote the introduction to the Kesavan Felicitation volume that I edited some years ago, which Prasoon you mentioned, I criticized him for his adherence to the legitimation theory and cited Shelley's critique of the theory. And I shared the draft of the introduction with him. And after reading it, he immediately called me to say that Shelley was not the first to be critical of the theory. He brought to my notice a 2001 review of Kunal Chakravarti's book, Religious Processes. So this was David's review of the book. And David had said in his review, somewhat sarcastically, that it is time to declare a 10-year moratorium on the use of the word legitimation among South Asianists. And I happily included this reference in my introduction. But given what I was saying, modesty forbade me from writing that. I am thankful to Kesavan Veluthat for drawing my attention to this review. The idea of legitimation is a flaw or a mistake. It is a dosha. But then the extent of my gray hair has expanded exponentially since the summer of 2017 when I wrote that introduction. So I am not any wiser, but I am certainly much more sober than I was 8 years ago. So I have now reconciled to the idea that everything must have some flaws within. Things will be dull and boring if it is all gunasannipata and no doshas at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Devadevan, for telling us about your agreements and disagreements with the author, and also, along with that, taking us through the different traditions of history writing and appreciation of poetry we've had regarding South Asia over the years, and what flows into finally the author historian's work. So that was fascinating. Thank you for the entire mm, sort of gamut of thoughts you've presented here. So let me see if we. Uh, so there is a question from someone named R. I'm sorry, the full name is not here, but for Professor Kesavan Veluthat, uh, if possible, please throw some light on how did you deal with the question of taking Mahabharat as a historical source, as there are debates among historians. What consensual arguments should one keep in mind? Also, please talk a little bit about the approaches and methodology one should consider while working on the Mahabharata. So then this is the question we have for the time. So let me actually invite the author, Professor Kesavan Veluthat, to talk about his experience of making this book, and also along with that, maybe address the two queries that we have, as well as if we don't get any queries in between, he has very kindly told us that he will give the vote of thanks to, give that and the uh, uh, discussion today. Yeah, Professor Veluthat, please tell us about your experience.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting question as to how one could take Mahabharata as a historical source. I may have to talk a little bit historiographically in answering this question. There was a time when the Mahabharata and Ramayana were taken as sources of history, believing that paraphrasing them could actually construct history. It is not long ago that we had the periodization of Indian history, which told us about the Vedic period followed by the epic period, assuming that the epics represented a particular phase of Indian history. But now the historian has tasted the apple and has shed much of his innocence. He now realizes that the Mahabharata is not a single text, that it has accrued from time to time, considerable additions are there. So when we ask this question, can the Mahabharata be taken as a historical source? We will have to ask the other question, which part of the Mahabharata, about which period? Here, in the essay that I have written here, I have argued that the Mahabharata has to be seen largely as consisting of two layers. One, the narrative layer, and the other, the didactic layer. The narrative layers can be taken as earlier and the didactic layers as later. Even here, one has to make a point. One doesn't have to really take the dates or the identity of individuals, the succession of rulers, etc., seriously. What we can, on the other hand, do is try and find out how it represents society, how it represents the economic activities there, how it represents the political organization. We see the organization in the earlier narrative portions entirely different in the later narrative portions. So if we take it that way, looking at the Mahabharata as consisting of these two major layers, and as these two, one as earlier and the other, and these two together representing a kind of social transition. That is what I have argued there. So, in a broad sense, yes, I should believe that the Mahabharata can be taken as a historical source, but not for reconstructing the chronology of individual rulers, not for reconstructing the political relations between one kingdom and another kingdom, but for broadly understanding the way in which society and economy functioned. The second part of the question about the methodology one should consider while working on the Mahabharata, I should believe that it depends on the problem that one is concerned with in looking at the Mahabharata. One cannot prescribe that, okay, anybody who reads the Mahabharata should follow this methodology and only this methodology. There isn't anything like that. Thank you very much.
So, Professor Veluthat, can I now request you, because there are no other questions, can I request you to tell us about how this book came about and how you wrote it, and then tell us about the experiences that you went through.
Esteemed panelists, other participants, and dear members of Team Primus. My friend Dr. Prasoon Chatterjee, who is responsible for this book in a big way, has assigned me two tasks. A, to tell you about the making of the book, and B, to propose a vote of thanks to wrap up this function. Honestly, I must say that both are somewhat hard for me. I'm totally overwhelmed this evening, not only by the generosity of my publisher, Primus Books, for bringing out this book so elegantly and organizing this event, and to the panelists for speaking so kindly, and for the participants for joining this event and making it such a grand success. I'm at a loss. What do I say? Lest I should choke, I take recourse to a written text. A. The first question that Prasoon has asked is, how was the book made? I should begin by saying that I had not planned a volume like this at all. I don't mean to say that it all happened in a fit of absent-mindedness. All I can say is that it finally ended up in this way. I had written a few essays, like what Manu had said, where literature and history are connected. When I was in Mangalore, and later when I moved on to University of Delhi, I took more seriously into reading literary texts in Sanskrit after my formal retirement, particularly during the time of COVID-19. During those horrible days, being confined to the four walls of my rented house in Kodunallur, there was practically nothing that I could do. My office was locked. I had no access to our somewhat rich library. My own collection of books were home, far away. Earlier, Professor David Shulman and his team had planned and invited some of us to a workshop on Manipur in May 2020 in Jerusalem, which we were all set to attend. That was cancelled. The only relief was the weekly reading sessions we had with the NEEM team in Jerusalem. Then Sudha came up with an idea. Why can't she and I read something every day? Of course, yes, we downloaded a few texts from the internet and started reading Raghumsha and Kumar Sambhava. After we were done with these, Sudha asked me, shall we go to Magha? I said, why not? Not showing the trepidation I had. We began discussing each verse with commentaries of Vallabhadeva and Malinatha. Gradually, we also acquired the English translations by Paul Dundas and C. Rajendra. As we progressed, I was jotting down in my arm what we had read, and by the time we reached chapter 4, I sent these notes to Sudha. She encouraged me, telling me that I should do it more systematically so that I could publish the translation, particularly as none existed in Malayalam. I showed it to a few other friends after completing all 20 chapters, and all of them told me that I should publish it. I published a Malayalam translation of Shichu. It was quite a success, going by the number of copies sold in less than a year. That encouraged me. I lay my hands on the Kiratarjaniya of Bharavi. That too was published somewhat with the same amount of success. As I was reading these Kāvyas, certain questions disturbed the student of history in me. For instance, Kalidasa describes the city of Ayodhya when it had been depopulated and declined, its mansions falling apart, and its streets infested by wild animals. The descriptions of other prosperous cities, such as Alaka or Jaini or Oshadiprastha, conform to the textbook descriptions, full of repetitions of stock phrases and formulaic expressions. I saw in these the lack of conviction in describing the prosperous cities and the realistic touch in the description of the decadent Ayodhya, a literary corroboration of R.S. Sharma's thesis of urban decay, constructed solely on the basis of archaeological evidence. So also, I saw how the same episode, for example, Arjuna winning a divine weapon from Shiva, is treated completely differently in the Mahabharata and the Kiratarjuna. I tried to find out an answer to a why in this man. Again, similar questions threw themselves up when I compared the episode of Krishna killing Shishupala in the Mahabharata and the Shishupala. I presented these questions and my tentative answers in seminars and talks in different places. These were largely in Malayalam, and I did not bother to write them as disciplined articles. I was too lazy. At this point in December 2023, I had occasion to meet my friend Dr. Sum Chatterjee of Primary. He asked me about my activities, and I told him that I was writing mostly in Malayalam, giving him some details. In spite of publishing 2 of my books earlier, he had not learned his lesson. He asked me if I could translate those Kāvyas into English so that he could publish them. I said no for various reasons. First of all, there were very good translations of these in English. Then he asked me if I could sit down and put down the subject of the talks I had given into full-length articles, which can be brought together between 2 covers. I gave into his friendly persuasion. Vanity, after all, is not a bad thing. I sat tight on it, organizing my questions and answers into disciplined research papers with all the necessary paraphernalia demanded by such formats. This is the story of the making of the book that Dr. Chatterjee has asked me to talk about. Now, the second part of my duty is to propose a vote of thanks.
One request, Professor Veluthat, I'm sorry to
Yes,
interrupt.
yes.
There is one question which is quite interesting, which has come in from Payal Ray. Would you please want to respond to that? I'll read it out to you. She
I can look
says,
at it.
yeah. Are the translated versions of Indian aesthetics books such as Abhinav Bharati or Panyaloka perpetuating any wrong interpretation of the text? Have you noticed any such misinterpretations? How can a rereading of those texts in their Sanskrit original revive and contribute to the area of Indian aesthetic theories?
Now,
Would you
honestly,
like
I
to
must
respond?
say that I haven't read English translations of either Abhinav Bharati or Dhanyaloka or Lochana. Now, what little reading I have is the Sanskrit original, and therefore I'm not competent to answer this question whether the translations have misrepresented the original. And I'm not competent to answer the question. How can a
Thank you, Professor.
rereading of those texts? The second part of the question is interesting. How can a rereading of those texts in their Sanskrit original revive and contribute to the area of Indian aesthetic theories? I think there is immense scope for this. In fact, now there have been scholars who are trying to do this. For example, the different commentaries on Lojana. Lojana itself is a commentary on Dhanyaloka. And the different commentaries on Lojana, they are now being collected together and brought together. So this allows us to read them afresh and also see how earlier generations of scholars had read the Dhanyaloka and its commentary Lojana. So that way it will be useful.
Thank
Now
you, Professor Veluthat. Yeah, if you could.
Now I'll go to the second part of my duty, that is to propose a vote of thanks. It's a proud privilege as it is, but it is nonetheless difficult for me. Usually, vote of thanks is a formality to close a proceedings, and formality, as you know, is inversely proportional to sincerity. In this case, however, every word I speak here is full of sincerity and packed with so much of emotion. Emotion has a peculiar feature about it. It does not respect protocol and decorum. So, if I am deviating from the expected order here, please believe me, it is not out of disrespect to anybody. First and foremost, I thank Sudha. To be sure, I had been initiated into Sanskrit Kavyas early in my childhood. In fact, a little too early for me to have understood anything. I can say without any exaggeration whatever that Sudha re-initiated me into that enchanting world. It is only a statement of plain fact that but for her, many of the chapters in this book and the translations of the Kavyas I was talking about would not have simply happened. She read every word of what I wrote, suggested alternatives. She contributed richly to the ideas contained in the book, which I have shamelessly claimed as my book. Thank you, dear Sudha. Another person who was responsible for this book is Rasool. He prodded me into actually writing the essays here. Then, after accepting the manuscript for publication, he accommodated all the innumerable demands I made. His team of colleagues in the Primus books put up with all my idiosyncrasies. I admire his patience, friendship, and quality of leadership. I do not really know how to thank him and his team for asking me to write this book and bring it out so elegantly. Thank you, Professor. And please convey my sense of gratitude to your colleagues. A galaxy of scholars took part in this panel to discuss my books. To all of them, David, Whitney, Yigal, Sudha, and Manu. Each one of them also telling me how I can improve the way in which I can read and write. I propose a sincere vote of thanks. Now, for instance, when David said that there was no whole of the Kāvya project, I take that point very, very seriously. But I am yet to be convinced. So I'll have to go back to the Kāvyas and find out is there any scope for looking at the rice only aspect of Kāvya. Similarly, David stressed my argument about the urban and proto-urban audience of my Pravada. I have developed this further in an address that I gave the Indian History Congress when the Indian History Congress elected me General President. In fact, there it is the urban and proto-urban aspects of the period of this. And Pravada is only one aspect of it, but other aspects I have taken up there. Then the other point that he makes that Manipurvalam was an assertion of Kerala's identity. This comes most clearly in Leela Tilaga, and this is the subject matter of an essay which my teacher, Raghava Warrior, has written in Malayalam. Then I like Yigal's representation of me as suffering from some kind of a schizophrenia, kind of bipolar disorder, a historian on the one side and a student of literature on the other. I like that idea. I take the point that Sudha made about why I should place the essay on Mahabharata as an appendix. This is for very technical reasons. The title of the book is about the Kāvya literature, and strictly speaking, Mahabharata cannot be included in that. But since I have referred to this essay, which I had published earlier in Malayalam, since I had made references to this essay, I thought it is important to give this. So I somewhat apologetically placed it as an appendix there. Sudha again criticizes me, rightly so, for not taking up the later Manipravalam text, such as the works of Manam, or even later Kunjan Nambiar, the Vanmani Nambodiris, and other. Now she is very right there. But here my scope is, in this particular essay, my scope is limited, and I have stated that this essay is concerned exclusively about the early Manipravalam, perhaps ending with the Sandesha Kavyas and Chandrotsava. So that way, I have taken an advance bail in that statement. All your suggestions, all the panelists, their suggestions and criticisms have raised the standard of my book and placed me under a debt of obligation. Thank you, dear friend. Last but not the least, as the cliche goes, I thank participants of this webinar who took time to listen to the proceedings and participate in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you. So we can leave now, perhaps. Thank you so much.
Plenty of time for my claps. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shulman, Sudhaji, Manu, Yigal.
Thank you,
So
Professor.
nice to be with you and hear your thoughts. Thank you, Whitney.
My pleasure.
Goodbye.
See you
Goodbye.
all.